היי לכולם, היי לכולן. אני מקווה ששומעים אותי ושהכל בסדר. אם לא, בטח אני עוד שנייה אראה בדיליי של 10 שניות נראה בתגובות. לא שומעים. טוב, אז ככה, לנו יש רגע מביך. מייק, עד כמה שהוא מדהים ונהדר ותמיד צחוקים איתו, דפק לי ברז. כאילו יכול להיות שהוא מגיע עוד מעט, יכול להיות שהוא מתעכב, יכול להיות תירוץ כלשהו, אבל כרגע המצב הוא כזה, מצב ביש. ניר, שגם היה אמור להרצות היום, קם עם גרון מפוצץ, ולכן הוא לא יכול לדבר, ומייק לא הגיע, אז אני קצת בדילמה מה לעשות עם הזמן שיש לנו כדי למרוח ככה את הזמן עד שהוא כן הגיע. בואו נראה. מה אפשר לעשות? יש לכם רעיונות בתגובות מה אפשר לעשות כדי למרוח את הזמן עד שהוא יגיע? אני יכולה לשלוף אחת מההרצאות הישנות שלי על מיתוג אישי למפתחים, על איך ממלאים CFP, טיפים למצגת טכנית. אני לא באמת חושבת שזה יעניין אתכם, אבל כאילו אתם פה בשביל אנגולר, איוניק, וכל מה שביניהם. אבל מייק לא פה. בינתיים אני אספר לכם, הנה דרך למרוח זמן, כנס בחינם, זה תמיד דבר נחמד, כנס בחינם, כנס סניקון, Dev Security, Ops, זה כל הדברים שאני לא מבינה בהם, כי כולנו יודעים שאני לא מפתחת, היי מייק הגיע, יש. Hey Mike, I'm gonna let you in on the air in a second. So I'll switch to English now. So SnickCon is a free conference for developers. There's a lot going on over there, so just check out the website, and they just wanted to let our community know that it's free, and they'll be really, really happy to see you all. So, hey Mike, how you doing?
Hello, how's it going?
I am doing great. Okay, so our audience is starting to show up. So first of all, thank you so much for helping us out. What time is it over there right now? Where is over there?
I'm in just south of Boston. It's 11 a.m. for me, so not too bad.
Yeah, at least one cup of coffee.
Done, I'm right? Already on. I'm like on cup number 3.
Number 3. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So you're not much into sleeping. Yeah.
What is sleep these days? Just sitting in bed with, eternal dread for the world.
Makes sense. Great. So we're going to start with the talk. I was just explaining to the people that Nir woke up this morning super sick, so he can't attend the meetup. But he promised that he has something really cool saved up for the next meetup, so you're going to do it then, don't worry. So it also means that you have all the time in the world to give your talk. There's no rush. I'm sure people will have tons of questions for you. And if you even want to share like off-topic material, such as how to work from home and survive it, like a lot of people are like struggling right now. We're back into quarantine, so we're struggling with working from home. So even if you want to give like off-topic advice like that, I'm sure that people would really, really appreciate someone with your experience telling us what to do. I'm struggling with Netflix, it's so hard. It calls me. It
calls everyone eventually, and at some point it's just gotta let the Netflix run through you, watch like a series or two, just get it out of your system, so that way you can be like, all right, I've done my Netflix binge, I've done my trashy TV shows, I got that out of my system. What can I do to be actually productive?
Yeah, but there's always another trashy TV show, that guilty pleasure. So hard.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm going to share your screen, and everyone have fun. We're going to give away at the end of my talk 2 free licenses to WebStorm from our sponsors, JetBrains, and of course a ticket to Angular Up conference. It is indeed happening. We announced today actually that our conference React Next is not happening, but let me just change that background a little bit. So we announced React Next is not happening. We just it's not going to be the same, but we are actually going to do a nice little reshuffle for Angular up to do make it happen virtually, but in a really, really awesome way. So stick around to the end of the meetup, hear the announcement, win some prizes and stuff, and have fun. Mike, the stage is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nair. This is I having the chance to actually do more meetups from home really has just been it's been the silver lining to this whole global pandemic lockdown thing. Though I miss traveling and seeing everyone. So hopefully next year we'll keep the fingers crossed and try to stay positive on that. But we're going to talk about cross-platform development and how we can rethink it. If you have any questions at the end of this, feel free to use the chat. Also, reach out to me on Twitter. I'm Hartington basically everywhere. It's pretty easy. Just look for the beard. You'll find me. And the term cross-platform, I think by just saying that, we might introduce some thoughts, some preconceived ideas as to what does this mean and what does this get me. So I hope that by the end of this, everyone kind of leaves with a new take on what cross-platform development can be, and what we at Ionic are trying to do to improve that entire story. But before we go into everything, I'm a big fan of history. So let's kind of go over the history of cross-platform development. Kind of understand where we came from to see what the future brings. We'll look at the current options that exist out there for building a cross-platform app, and then we'll touch on Capacitor towards the end and how that can be a good option for developers. So it's hard to think of a time when people didn't have mobile devices as we know them today. The original iPhone was released in 2007 with the SDK for it being released the following year. Android had their own SDK released in 2009. And between both of these SDKs and the entire native tooling and ecosystem, there's roughly a decade of material development. There's a lot that has gone into making these native SDKs a polished, more streamlined, and I don't like to say it, but simple process for people. If you're trying to add a native package or a third-party package to a native app, you have CocoaPods for iOS or and Android libraries for obviously Android. So building a native app these days or using a native SDK has had so much thought and development gone into it that the process has become a lot more streamlined. Now, at the very beginning, these were very difficult tools to work in. And there's always been people who rejected that idea. Now, a lot of these people have kind of, gone in and hacked their way around it. And we'll look at one in a minute. But their idea was, we don't want to use native tooling. Most of them were web developers by trade. And for them, learning these native tools were kind of, I need to learn it because I want to go back and write better web code, or I want to write web apps. So they'll go through and hack around it to get web apps into a native app. And this led to the creation of, I don't know if it's the first, but I will claim it is the first cross-platform toolchain that people know about, Cordova. You probably heard of it as the name PhoneGap. This is the open source version of it, Cordova, under the Apache Foundation. So Cordova's real value, or its real kind of mantra, was write once and run anywhere. They didn't want you to have to create your app for multiple different platforms, for multiple different browsers. They wanted to give you the web as its core, and then polyfill the features that don't exist on certain platforms. A really great example here is geolocation. So in the early days of Cordova, geolocation on a mobile device was not quite available through JavaScript. There were some proposed standards to add this to the browsers, and the Cordova team created an API for Cordova that allowed people to experiment with this API, and it would fall back to using the native implementation. So it had this bridge technology where once you call JavaScript, it could batch out and go to native land and execute that code for you. So in a sense, Cordova really prided itself on being a polyfill, giving you access to all these different APIs that didn't exist in the browser, but were going to exist once they got standardized. And this led to a pretty interesting end goal for them, and that was to cease to exist. Their idea was, we just want to help people build with the web and ship to the stores and build the best web apps that they can, accessing features like geolocation, the camera, what have you, through JavaScript. Now, architecturally, this was a fairly, is a fairly simplified version of it. But what you had was your web app being loaded inside of a native web view. Now, this web view would be able to intercept calls from the web app and then communicate them back to this bridge layer. So if you were to call get geolocation or camera.getPicture, that would emit something from the that little blue app to the web view, and then that web view would call the bridge, and that would batch out to the proper hardware and device features, get the data from that, serialize it, and then send it back to the web view, which would then return it to the app. So it's there's some details in there that some people might say, "Ooh, well, it's not quite that," but that's the general idea. And so to do that, they created all these different objects and mapped them onto Navigator. So to get a picture with Cordova, we have this navigator.camera.getPicture function, and it has an onSuccess and onFail callback, and also a third parameter of passing in different options. So if you wanted to say, give me a really poor quality image, you could pass in an option of quality and set the value to 25. Now, once this got called, we'd either fire onSuccess or onFail. OnSuccess, we just grab an image from the DOM, and then we'd set that image source attribute to the base64 string that gets returned. Now, interestingly enough, this kind of breaks Cordova's original goal of polyfilling APIs, because there is no navigator.camera.getPicture API. So this could only run in a Cordova iOS, Cordova Android, in a Cordova environment. It can't run without it. So kind of breaks things. So we'll kind of deduct some points on Cordova for there. But the idea of mapping these device features to to some kind of global and then being able to call them really is a compelling story. Now, they also had a little quirk where if you wanted to call some native code, for instance, if you want to get your device's location on startup, you needed to wait for this thing called device ready. Now, device ready is an event that's emitted on the web view that basically says, okay, I'm the native web view. I'm the native bridge. We have done our little handshake to say, okay, we're ready to communicate. We're ready to receive events and publish events to the web view, to and from one another. Call your native code. So once that handshake kind of happened, the web view would actually fire this device ready event, meaning that you could call native code. Now, this, like I said, this was a kind of, a weird quirk about Cordova, because if you're on, say, a moderative, a very fast like Android or iOS device like I have here, this delay was negligible. You couldn't even notice it. On older devices or older versions of Android or devices that had just not great specs, this could be 1 to 2 seconds. This led to people assuming Cordova was just really slow, when in fact their device is actually, just either their device was really slow or the web app that they're trying to load was really large. So it's responsible for a lot of misconceived ideas about Cordova. So moving on from that, though, once you had that basic setup done, times were actually pretty good. You could start building great apps for iOS, Android, Windows, Electron these days, and Mac OS, and even older devices that or platforms that could have been supported were things like BlackBerry, WebOS, Tizen, Symbian. These kind of obscure devices that don't really exist anymore, at the time were hugely popular. BlackBerry being one of the bigger ones. But now that we've solidified our OS choices these days, we have at least 5 platforms that we can choose from, and being able to target all of them with Cordova. There also is a huge community of plugins. Chances are, when you've been around for like 10 plus years, people build stuff on your platform. So if you want to do anything with Cordova, chances are there's a plugin out there that could do that and has pretty good documentation and good release strategies. So being able to access, say, third-party payments through something like Braintree, or in-app payments with Apple's in-app purchases and Google Play's in-app purchases. You could do that. There are some edge cases, though. Aside from that device ready event being a really weird quirk about the project, the Cordova project and Cordova ecosystem really relies on custom tooling for everything. So what do I mean by this? Well, if you wanted to add a plugin to a Cordova project, to do so, you need to actually call Cordova plugin add, which itself is using npm under the hood. But to do that, they actually install it to a folder outside of npm. They use this plugins folder, which, okay, that's is what it is. But then when you go to build the project, they have this custom script that runs to copy the plugin and to do all these merge conflicts with different plugin packages of different dependencies. There's so much custom tooling involved with the Cordova project that once you go in and you have something that doesn't fit quite right, the whole entire piece falls apart, and you're left feeling very frustrated or very sad. In addition to that, if you wanted to add a native project like iOS or Android and then modify that native project, there was no really easy way to maintain that across different computers, different teammates, unless you committed that native project to source control. Cordova's main idea was that these native projects are just part of the build process or a build artifact. You weren't expected to actually open these projects in Xcode or Android Studio. You were expected to build the project and then delete the native platform in some sense. Like, there were ways to pass in the proper signing certificates, the proper configuration, which again goes back to that first point of custom tooling for everything, when a native project and a native IDE handles that really well. So these volatile native projects made it so that way, if you configured a native OS project for signing on this platform with this computer, if your teammate goes to clone that project and then tries to do the same thing, they're probably going to run into some issues. And I don't want to make it seem like I'm saying that being an open source community project is a bad thing, but I think we should note that Cordova as a project has seen some some big hits when it comes to community contributions. Cordova was maintained and supported by several companies like Adobe, Apple had a few folks contributing, Google, Microsoft. Now, most of those big corporate kind of sponsors or contributors have stepped away. And it's now just being maintained by a really dedicated team of developers who are doing this in their spare time. Not to say that that's a bad thing, but it just goes to show that if these people don't want to work on this anymore, what's going to happen to Cordova? I don't have the answers. I don't think they have the answers. So the overall project health and the contributions being solely driven by community is always, something to be aware of. So moving on from Cordova, let's take a look at React Native and similar projects. I know this is technically an Angular meetup, but we all probably have written a line or two of React, and if not, it's going to look close enough to HTML that you can, just kind of, you can understand it. So React Native and similar, what do I mean about these? These are projects that give you an abstraction around native controls and sell the promise of truly native apps. So one of the big things that I've taken away from React Native is the idea of learn once, write anywhere. And that is they saw the failure in their eyes of write once, run anywhere from Cordova or other projects where, no, each platform is really different. So trying to write one code base that can accommodate all of those, that's never going to work. If we can give you an abstraction around the primitives and then allow you to take that code and that knowledge and then say, okay, I want to write a div or I want to write some text. Here's the primitive. Now write it for iOS and Android using these libraries, and you will get that native text field for those apps. So the idea is just learn the core concepts and the abstractions, and then write for all those different platforms. Now, in doing this, they kind of sold people on the promise of this is going to be a truly native app, which is kind of not the case. When you are writing a React Native app or something of similar, in that same kind of spirit, you're essentially writing the abstraction that gets processed on the device, and then it's going to generate all that UI at runtime. So the architectural overview of this, we have our React app or our JavaScript inside of the blue circle square. And then inside of that, it's being run inside of a JavaScript VM. So this would be JavaScript core on iOS or V8 on Android. Now, as it's trying to run this app, it is passing the data back and forth to this bridge layer, which is responsible for rendering out the UI, as well as accessing device features. If that is the approach that you go to, you can go into much more complex kind of features where you have some additional native code that exists on the side of your web app. And then you have multiple projects that, okay, well, now you need to maintain this version of the native code, and then this version of the native code, and then here's the web code. So you get this kind of much more complicated structure on how a React Native project could look like. At its simplest model, this is it. But no, your miles, your miles, your kilometers, your distance may vary with how this works. At its basis, though, we have this class called Hello World that extends component. This is just some basic React where we're pulling in the React namespace and then the component base. From here, we're actually importing components from React Native. So text and view are essentially a paragraph tag for text and a glorified div for view. When we want to actually render this, we're using React's paradigm of using a render method and then returning the JSX representation of what would be essentially a view or a div, and then some text, which would essentially be a paragraph text. So this would just say, hello world, inside of our app. Now, it's important to note that the components coming from the React Native package are the core paradigms or the core components. So you're going to get your view, your switch, your text, your image components. You're going to get the core things that you would expect to find from a native SDK, and probably not a whole lot more. This is where third-party libraries kind of come in and really, step up. I'm not particularly a huge fan of React Native, but if someone were to ask me, hey, what's the best library for React Native? I would say Expo, because it kind of fills in all the missing pieces that React Native doesn't give you. So in this case, if I want to say create a live camera feed, I could go ahead, create a view, give it a style flex of 1, which is basically means make this view extend to the whole viewport. And then I could import this camera component from Expo. Now, this camera component is going to basically handle wiring up the logic to call the camera, get a video feed or an image feed from that, and then display it in real time. Notice nothing about this camera says, hey, go call this primitive on Android or this primitive on iOS. Just here's the camera, render it. Which is, again, really big sell for Expo, but they do a really good job. So from this, we just render this out and then we call it done. But I needed to bring in a third-party library, which maybe is a downside to some, maybe not to others, but it's worth noting. Now, downside to these kind of technologies, and I'll continue picking on React Native, is that it's very corporate driven. Where Cordova was 100% community, React Native is basically driven by Facebook. They have the final say of how React Native, what features React Native has, how the code base looks. Yeah, you can contribute to it a little bit, but it's basically their project. If they don't want to use it or if they don't want to maintain it, they can delete it. And they can say, okay, we're done with React Native. We're not going to maintain it anymore. Now, I don't think they would do that, but that could happen. So this corporate-driven development for React Native, I look at it as being a real -1 for them. They don't really have a good story on how the community gets involved in any more official ways than just make third-party libraries. Speaking of community, there's actually a smaller community of React Native developers than one would think. I know a lot of us are on Twitter or on social media, and we see people talking about, oh, React Native's taking over the world, React Native this, React Native that. But if you're looking to hire people, or if you're looking to start a team or a company, finding React Native developers is actually quite hard. And finding good React Native developers is even more difficult. Chances are you're probably better off finding native developers and then teaching them JavaScript than finding people who are 100% specialized in React Native. In addition to the community, there's also varying qualities of plugins. I know that there is a React Native community contribution or community contributed plugins repo for things like React Navigation, React Date Picker. But that repo doesn't cover every use case. And so people go looking out for third-party packages to add to their project. Are they high quality? Who knows? Just try them. And if they're bad, remove them. That can be quite complicated. And at the end of the day, you still do need a lot of native knowledge to add additional features that don't exist out there. If you want to say add a feature to a project and there's no native plugin for it, you're going to have to write that plugin. You're going to have to write that package and make sure that you are communicating back and forth between the native layer and React Native correctly. And that can be really difficult. Now, one more downside that's not listed here that I know it used to be the case. I'm not 100% sure how this is today. So I removed the slide. But upgrading a React Native project apparently is a nightmare. If you've ever had to do it, there's like a whole doc page on how you have to upgrade it, and it's like, all right, first commit everything because this could get really scary right now. So I don't know if that's still the case. So I don't have have it listed here in the slide, but let me know if that's still the case. I kind of want to know, has that upgrade story gotten a lot better? So in general, React Native, it's not as cross-platform as advertised. Neither is Cordova in a sense, because they're creating their own custom APIs that don't exist in the browser. So we get this really weird ecosystem where all these cross-platform tools that we have been using for 10 years now don't get us 100% of the way there. And this led us at Ionic to start to think, can we do this in a better way? And I think we've got something with this project called Capacitor. So Capacitor is a project that has two parts. There is a native runtime, which gives you an app shell that you can load in a web app. So that takes care of the kind of Cordova approach to how you do things. At the same time, there's also a runtime library that you can include and import into your project that allows you to talk and communicate to things like geolocation, Bluetooth, camera, device features that you would expect to get from native platforms. In doing so, we created something that feels very at home for web developers. They're importing things from the package, they're adding it to their JavaScript, and then behind the scenes, we're actually using the native tooling and the native packages to pull in all of this code. So if you have a third-party plugin, your developers are going to import the object from the package itself as if it was just regular JavaScript. And behind the scenes, we're adding things like the CocoaPod reference, the Android library reference, and modifying the build scripts. We're doing all that behind the scenes. So people get the best of both worlds without having to worry about it. Now, the architectural overview is pretty similar. We have this web view that is in the native land that loads our JavaScript web app. So this could be written in Angular, React, Vue. Capacitor doesn't have a preference to what framework that you should use. It can load anything, even web apps that are not written with a framework. From here, it has this bridge layer, which allows us to make calls from our app to the web view. It publishes that to the bridge, which calls out to the different device features, sends that back, serializes the data, and sends it back to the JavaScript app. So this is basically the same architectural overview as all of them, except that with the web view, we're able to ensure that that connection between the web view and the bridge is already set up. So there is no device ready. There is no delay in when you can call native code. If you throw in, say, an index.html into your app and you try to call some native feature, as soon as that index.html is loaded, you can call that. There is no device ready. There is no waiting for this stuff to happen. So we get a faster experience right out of the box. Important thing to note is that Capacitor doesn't really focus on the component layer. This is still something that we think Cordova did right. So you can bring your own component library. For example, if you are using Ionic, you can use our components and build a capacitor app, and you're basically done. If you're using something like Angular Material, you can still use that. We don't have a preference on what components that you should be using, just that you should probably have components. And the API that you write against is not a one-to-one for web standards. So the standard for getting a camera or taking a picture and using the camera with JavaScript is something like media devices.getUserMedia. With capacitor, you're just calling capacitor or camera.getPicture. But it's able to map back to the correct web standard and to the native implementations as well. And we can look at this in our demo. And like I mentioned, the runtime, the bridge, that whole connection and handshake process is done behind the scenes and makes sure that the app loads instantly. This is not for everyone, though. If you do need to support old Android, which maybe old in air quotes, because that just means anything below Android 5.0, which is less than 10%. If you need to support that, less than 10% of users, maybe pick a different project. But you can get pretty far by supporting 5.0 and up. But your analytics will tell you further. iOS, we take an approach of N-1. So I need to update this slide with iOS 14. So it's 14 and then 13 would be the versions that we support. Maybe in this case, we'll still have support for 12 at the moment, but whatever you can build with inside of Xcode, you should be able to build with capacitor. So again, this tends to be N-1 or N-2, depending on the time of the year. So let's actually go in and take a look at how capacitor works. So right now, I'll switch over to my terminal and bump that font size because that's tiny. And I'm just going to run. I build mine using Ionic, but let's see. Let's just do ng serve -- open. And we're just going to open up an Angular Ionic project. Nothing too crazy here. We'll just let Ivy do its thing for a moment. So this will build up and hopefully will load. Awesome. So this is looking good. I'm actually going to use Chrome instead. So let's bring this over here. Let me just get my setup all taken care of. Cool, that looks good. So our project so far, the only big thing to note is that we have this capacitor config.json file. And this allows us to configure our project setting. So if we wanted to change the bundle ID, this is something that should be unique to each app. And it's like a reverse lookup of your domain. So if my domain was mhartington.io, my app ID would be something like io mhartington.app, something like that. It doesn't really matter, but it should be unique to your own product. App name, we could change this to be something like Mike's app. Bundle web time framework or bundle web runtime, we can set this as false because we're using a framework, and that allows us to bundle our JavaScript together. The webdir basically is where is our web app going to get built to. So in this case, we're building to a folder called www or www. So it'll pull all that source code from there. And then we can start to configure the default settings for the plugins. So in this case, we're just saying splash screen. Don't set the launch show duration to 0. So don't even bother showing that. This Cordova object is pretty interesting because if you have an app that still needs to use certain Cordova plugins or certain plugins that we don't have in the capacitor ecosystem, we can still support it. We've added Cordova support and integrations in there as well. So think of this more as a crutch and not as a feature. I would suggest using all of the core capacitor plugins if you can, but you can still use some of the Cordova ones if you need to. So our app itself, we have, again, a standard Angular, Ionic Angular project. So let's go open our tab 1 component. And what we're first going to do is import from capacitor core. And we're going to import this plugins object. Now, the plugins object is where we get access to all of the different plugins available. So I'm going to create a method called getLocation, and I'm going to destructure some stuff from this plugins object. So I'll just create an empty object at the moment and say its value is plugins. And then I'm going to get geolocation off of that. This is just a nice little way, so that way you're not mapping through every single object, but we can just pull in one specific instance. I'm also going to create a class property called lock, and we'll just set that to any bad TypeScript pattern. So do as I say, don't as I do as I do. And we'll make this an async method because all of Capacitor's APIs are actually asynchronous. So in this case, we'll say const data equals await geolocation get current position. So this should feel pretty simple to any developer who's been using JavaScript these days. We're just awaiting get current position. Notice that it's not telling us how are we getting the current position, just to get it. So with this, we can say this.lock equals data.coordinates. And this we could even further reduce this to something where we say, okay, get me the latitude and longitude. But we also have a bunch of optional fields that get returned as well. So things like altitude, heading, speed, altitude accuracy, these are all fields that are optional because they don't exist in some platforms, but they exist in others. So we can safely code against that. And TypeScript is really helping us out here. So if we wanted to do, render this, we could just save and then go over to our tab1.html. And I'm just going to do some cleanup. So I will render out pre, which is going to render out lock and pipe that through JSON. Then I'm going to use an ion button. You could use a regular button as well, or a material design button. And we're just going to call get location. And then say, where am I? So just to make sure that we have everything good, get location. Oh, that looks great. So let's save this. And I'm going to say, where am I? You can see we have this little tab up here where we say, okay, location is that. What happened? Because we now have an error. Do we have an error? Let's see what was the issue. Where am I? Give me the location, please. Okay, well, this is great because we also have all of this kind of thrown together in a nice little landing page on our site. So like any project, if we run into issues, we have these things called docs where we can look over all the different implementations. So in this case, let's look over the geolocation API. We can say, all right, constant coordinates, get current location. All right, well, let's try a console log just to see how that looks. So we'll say console.log data. See, are we getting any data coming back from our get location call? Okay, so we are getting data. We're getting some coordinates, and we are getting things coming back. So what is the issue? Well, what we can do instead, technical difficulties are always fun. We can actually, if we want to see a real just example, if we scroll down a little bit here on the main page, we can click on this Angular example and see the same thing in this example. So this is just doing the same exact demo. So let's just render this all together. So instead of using data and rendering all that, let's just get the whole entire object, see how that works. Oh no, it doesn't want to work for me. You know what? I think this is probably just an issue with Chrome itself, because we could try this out on a native platform. So let's go over to our terminal and actually just stop this app. So I want to try this out on, say, iOS. So to do this, we can just run npx cap. So we're just going to run the capacitor CLI itself, and we can say add iOS. But first, to do this, we need to actually build our app. So we'll just run ng build, which will just go ahead, do our typical build command for our project. So this is going to be a non-production build just for speed. Let this do its thing. Me wait patiently while we're generating ES5 bundles, which one of the new features coming out in Angular that I'm really excited about is ES 2015 by default. So that means this timely process of generating my old browser bundles, I don't need to worry about that anymore. So we built our app, and now we're just going to call npx cap add iOS. So this is going to create us a native iOS project. So you can see we're installing a whole bunch of native dependencies. And if we zoom out, this is using CocoaPods. So behind the scenes, this is what native developers actually use. So if we zoom in again, we can see we get this output from that command saying npx cap open iOS. Pretty nice. So let's run npx cap open iOS. All right, well, this is Xcode. If you've never used Xcode before, don't worry. It's not too confusing. It's basically just running iTunes or something of similar sorts. So we have this selector up here where we can pick the different targets we want to deploy to. If I had my phone connected, I could run to that, but I have a bunch of simulators here, so that works out well. We have our native project features, so we can handle signing. We can handle all of the different features or build phases that we would need to customize. We can change our app display. We can change anything that we really need to. So this also includes things like the image assets, so our app's splash screen and launch images, as well as actually just maybe modifying the native Swift here. So if we want to do anything extra here, we could as well. It's a good one that I've seen people do is add additional logging features. So if they want to use not only log their web app, but then log native bugs, they could do that as well. I'm just going to hit play up here, which is going to run our native project and build it and install it on this simulator. So you can see that it runs up there. Simulator always takes a little bit to attach, and we have our app running. So let's go ahead. Oh, allow Mike's app to use your location. Sure. So this is a native notification or a native alert for getting your location. I'm going to say, yeah, allow while using the app. So it's going to get my location. It's going to return that, give it a second to do its thing. I might need to test it again. And cool, I'm getting actual location data on the device. So this is great. If I want to deploy this to the App Store as just a get my coordinates app, I have something here. I could also deploy it to some hosting providers like Netlify, Vercel, Firebase Hosting. And because those have HTTPS by default, I'd be able to access the same device feature. So with that, let's kind of go back to the slides. So this has been like a little bit of a whirlwind tour of Capacitor, but it does give me a good idea to give you a good idea of what can you do and how does that whole process work. So I mentioned the web as kind of like an afterthought of just deploying this to some static hosting provider. What if there are features from native Capacitor that don't exist on the web? Well, you by default, you have support for things like progressive web apps with the APIs because they swap back and forth and you use web platform features when available. But if you wanted to say have a camera picker or a camera element or camera UI, you can use this optional third-party package that we've created called Ionic PWA Elements, and it's going to polyfill those features if you need them. So again, it's optional. You don't need to install it, but it could be a good feature to use if you want to have that on the web. And right now, our main platforms that we target are iOS, Android, and the web. There are community platform efforts for things like Electron that are still very early on. But if you want to target probably, 98% of the users in the world, anything here can be good for you. And if you want to start experimenting this and you already have an existing Angular project, you could just run ng-add at Capacitor Angular and get all this for free. So some parting thoughts real quick is if you have a web app and you want to start adding cross-platform features, Capacitor is a good way to do this. It gives you the chance to write a single API and then have Capacitor manage the different implementations. This could be a good solution for some teams, could not be a good solution for other teams. It really depends on what are you trying to build and experiment. Some people find that this is a great solution for them. Some people still think, no, it's not for me, and that's fine. Important thing to know is that pick the right tool for your team. I think Capacitor can cover a lot of use cases for web developers, but I'm not on your team, so I don't know that. Now, if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them now. Otherwise, reach out to me on Twitter at mhartington. I will be posting this link to these slides as soon as I'm done. Thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We have so far one question from the audience. Anyone else, if they want to ask questions, feel free to do so. So one question that was raised is NG zone active to detect changes?
So that, no, it shouldn't be. Because of the way zone works, it should be able to detect all these different changes. As you saw inside of the iOS example, I wasn't actually calling change detection or using or trying to remember. Is this okay? I think I'm getting myself confused. Is NG Zone active in that app? Yes, and that's just to catch the updates coming from get location. If you're using something, if you're using zoneless Angular, or you should be looking at things like NGRX component or RX Angular state to manage all these updates. Those could also work as well.
Okay, cool. So if anyone has any other questions, feel free to ask. Do you have any tips to share with the audience about working from home?
So great tip that I found is when you're pretty bored during the day or you just feel like, I don't want to do anything anymore, go get a musical instrument if you have one. I have several guitars that are always by my side, just in case.
That's interesting. I use a cat yodeling device. You're familiar with cat yodeling?
I am not familiar with cat yodeling. What is cat yodeling?
Cat yodeling. It's like it's like a very easy instrument. So you grab your cat and you just start to like really annoy it, like until it's like really like screams at you, and you just kind of like. Right now she's a bit silent, but usually she's like a whining, and then you just like kind of like shake it and you're like
Oh,
so
poor little thing.
That's a lovely instrument of yeah. Usually she's the one who interrupts you for working from home. It's like, oh, you're on a Zoom call. I'm sure they want to see my butthole. That's a cat.
I have my office door shut for that very reason. And right around the time when they're ready to be fed, not when they normally get fed, but when they are ready to get fed, they will just throw their bodies against the door like it is the end of the world. They're just like, feed us. And if you did not know what it was, it would sound like your office was about to get broken into.
Makes sense. I'm like that too when I'm hungry. Makes sense. Isn't
everyone?
Hangry. So Gail, the one who asked the question, I thought that maybe the view did update due to zone issues, but if it's running, that's very weird.
Yeah, so sometimes if you are running, trying to get things like geolocation or camera on localhost or without using HTTPS, that can be problematic. Sometimes the browsers don't like it when you do features like that in an unsecure context.
Okay, we got another question. Can you integrate native code with capacitor here?
Yes, so there's two ways to actually do this. We have a, let me go back to my documentation.
Share your screen.
All right, so we have two different ways to do this. You could create your own plugin, and this would only make sense if you had some kind of feature or some SDK that you wanted to make publicly available. So if you had like your own third-party SDK, like I am PayPal and I want to ship a integration for that, I could create my own plugin and then do it through that process. And that's pretty simple to do. If you didn't want to do that and you just wanted to add some third-party code, you have full access to all of the native project settings. So in here, I could go modify this to my heart's content and integrate things like maybe if I want to integrate Sentry for error tracking without ever having to install a plugin. So the options are kind of, what do you want to do? Do you want to make a public-facing API? Do that. Do you just want to add something additional? Do inside the app delegate.
Okay, cool. Any other questions to your audience? Anything else? Nope, doesn't look like it. Okay, so I'll give you my advice for, I'll give you the audience, not Mike, I'm sure Mike is fine, about something I do for productivity. You know how there's like interval training, like when you do something, you repeat and do something, you repeat, right? So there's something called the Pomodoro method. Like after I told a friend of mine, she was like, oh, like the Pomodoro method. So apparently it's kind of like a method, Google it, Pomodoro, like a tomato. And it's about working, pausing. Basically what I do is I was like, okay, I choose the series that I binge. And if an episode is 45 minutes, so I take a 45-minute break, which is the episode, and then I got to give at least that same amount of time working. So it's like I put a timer on and I'm not leaving my keyboard until it's 45 minutes. And then when it's on, boom, I go watch another episode. When it's done, it's done. I go back to work. Timer, 45 minutes. And then just like spend days doing it. It actually works. And I get to binge a lot. So it's awesome. Oh, Teddy has another question. It's like follow-up. The point is that vendors still deliver Cordova plugins and not that many capacitor.
So in that case, you could still add those Cordova plugins. Like I mentioned, we have support for them as like a migration path. But if you have anything specific, please tweet at me. I would love to know what use cases and what APIs you're trying to use.
Yeah, okay, here's Mike's Twitter handle again, in case you haven't written that down. Follow Mike, and I'm sure you can approach him in any questions that you have. And I guess that's it for Mike. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to the raffle. Mike, you don't have to stick around for that. I'm sure you're like busy and stuff. We had the little scheduling issue. So thank you again.
Cool. Take care.
Okay, bye. So, for the raffle, אני עוברת לעברית, כי מייק לא פה, אז אין צורך לדבר באנגלית. לגבי הגרלה, אני הולכת לעשות את זה ממש ממש קל. אני הולכת לפרסם את המייל שלי, ושלושת הראשונים שהולכים להמליץ לי על משהו לראות בנטפליקס, יזכו בפרס. הראשון יקבל כרטיס לאנגולר אפ, השני והשלישי יקבלו רישיונות לוובסטורם. אז הנה המייל שלי, תכתבו לי משהו בנטפליקס, ואל תדאגו אם ראיתי את זה, ותאמינו לי, אין לי חיים, הגיוני שראיתי את זה. זה לא יפסול אתכם מהגרלה, תרגישו חופשי לשלוח המלצות, כל מה שנראה לכם טוב, ואז פתרתי לעצמי את הפינה הזאת. בזמן שאתם שולחים את המייל שלכם עם המלצה לנטפליקס, אני אספר לכם על מה הולך לקרות עם אנגולר אפ. אז כן, כולנו יודעים שכנסים וירטואליים זה not the same, זה קצת מרגיש כמו פשוט כאילו ישיבת זום אחת ארוכה. אז במקום זה מה שאנחנו הולכים לעשות, אנחנו הולכים לפצל את אנגולר אפ, זה כבר לא יהיה יום אחד, זה הולך להיות בעצם שבוע שלם, שכל ערב יהיה לכם איזה 3-4 שעות להנאתכם, לדעתי 3 שעות של הרצאות, שבעצם תוכלו ליהנות בהם בשעות הערב, כשיש לכם כבר קצת יותר זמן. ההרצאות יהיו גם עם הרצאות בעברית, אנחנו עכשיו מנצלים את ההזדמנות בשביל גם להכניס הרצאות לעברית, כי כן היה לזה ביקוש בשנים הקודמות, מה שאומר שאנחנו גם נפתח מחדש את הכל קורא, להוסיף על הליינאפ הקיים מרצים ישראלים. אנחנו גם הולכים לעשות אנקונף, זאת אומרת שיהיה בכל סוף יום הרצאות של אנשים שלא ירצו בעבר, וזה בסדר, ואם בא לכם להיות ספונטני ולחלוק את משהו, איזה use case, וזה פשוט איזה משהו מגניב שנראה לכם שהקהילה תהנה ממנו, אז כדאי לכם לנסות ככה להציע ולהשתתף. ואין לנו כל מיני כזה משחקים מגניבים, וכל מיני אתגרים מיני הקטונים וכאלה, אנחנו נוציא את כל העדכונים ממש ממש בקרוב, כרגע אנחנו קצת עמוסים עם כל מה שקשור עם React Next, אבל ממש ממש בקרוב צפו לעדכונים, ויום השבוע, וכן כמובן, מחיר הכרטיס הולך לצנוח לפחות מחצי, אז בכלל כאילו, כזה. אז בואו נראה, מי שלא הולך לי, אז ההמלצה הראשונה, עומר יערי, שהמליץ לי על The Social Dilemma, ברכות, לא ראיתי את זה עדיין, אני לגמרי אקח את ההמלצה שלך, יהיה אם מצאתי מה לעשות הערב, ומזל טוב אתה זוכה בכרטיס לאנגולר אפ. ויש פה את עמית בקנשטיין, שהמליץ לי על Stranger Things, נו מה, אני בכיתה א', מי לא רואה Stranger Things, אבל עדיין זכית ברישיון לוובסטורם, ויש לנו את שירלי עטלי, אני ממש ממש מקווה שאני אבטא את זה נכון, אם לא סליחה, שמצל טהרן, שגם כן לא ראיתי, ולגמרי נכנס עכשיו ל-to-do list, אז ברכות, אתם שלושת הזוכים, גם אם לא זכיתם ואתם רוצים להמליץ לי מה לראות בנטפליקס, אני מאוד אשמח לקבל מכם מייל, אם יש לכם איזשהם שאלות, אתם רוצים לדבר במיטאפ הבאים שלנו, כל דבר, הצעות לייעול, שיפור וכן הלאה, אז תודה רבה 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 לכם, ההקלטה כמובן של המיטאפ נמצאת בערוץ שלנו, שיהיה לכם ערב מצוין, תשארו בבית, אם אתם רוצים, צאו עם מסכה בחייאת.